Presenting What Evidence Do Stratfordians Really Have? Part 2, London Evidence. This is another in the Shakespeare authorship game playlist. This is another video in the Shakespeare authorship game playlist. This is also a sequel to What Evidence Do Stratfordians Really Have? Part 1, Stratford Evidence. We're going to go briefly over some points made in the previous video on evidence, beginning with a quote from Dr. Richard Wagaman.
One of the most important intellectual skills that universities try to impart to their students is critical thinking. It is now more important than ever as ideological extremists and social media spread falsehoods. Departments of English are on the front lines in teaching the skills of critical thinking. So it is especially ironic, even dangerous, that examination of who wrote Shakespeare should be made explicitly exempt from a critical, impartial evaluation of evidence.
The nature of evidence. The definition of evidence from the Canadian government's Employment and Social Development website is all the means by which any alleged matter of fact, the truth of which is submitted to investigation, is established or proved. Direct evidence from that same website is defined as something that relates firsthand to the fact that one wishes to prove or disprove. Indirect or circumstantial evidence is something that cannot prove the primary fact, but which may prove other peripheral or related facts. Incontrovertible evidence is evidence introduced to prove a fact in a trial which is so conclusive that by no stretch of the imagination can there be any other truth as to that matter. From law school application advice and resources, incontrovertible evidence means evidence that proves something without any doubt. It is like a puzzle piece that fits perfectly and leaves no room for any other possibility. The Oxford English Dictionary, the concise version, defines incontrovertible as not to be disputed. It is the same as incontestable, that cannot be disputed. What makes good evidence? According to Professor Walter Hurst in his presentation, What is Your Authority for That Statement? An Approach to Examining External Evidence of Early Modern Authorship. Let us examine each piece of external evidence closely for the specifics of who, what, where, when, why, and how, and perhaps its relationship to the authorship of a piece of literature will be clearer. Its value, if any, as good evidence of that authorship will be distinct, strong, sharp, and as well defined as it can possibly be. The main question in this case is the evidence relevant, probative, distinct, strong, sharp, and well defined enough to lead us to conclude the Stratford businessman had a writing career. What evidence do Stratfordians really have? The London Evidence. These are all the facts of his life as London references. He was named in a payment notice from 1595. William Whately issued a surety of the peace against him in 1598. He owed taxes from 1596 to 1600. Co-purchased Blackfriars Gatehouse in 1601. He owned shares in Blackfriars Playhouse in 1599. He may have owned shares in the Globe Playhouse as early as 1599. He was named as a member of the King's Men in 1603. He was named a groom of the bedchamber in 1603. He was issued red cloth for King's procession March 15, 1603. Augustine Phillips bequeathed him 30 shillings in his will 2 years later in 1605. In 1609 he makes poor relief payment in Southwark. He makes a deposition in Bellet versus Mountjoy suit from 1612, and with John Hall, his son-in-law, meets Stratford town clerk Green with regards to enclosures November 17th and December 23rd, 1614. He is said to be dead in Ostler versus Hemmings lawsuit, May 1615. The item in blue is definitively the same man as the Stratford businessman. The last point is contentious and will be part of another video. Let's briefly look at some London properties. He has mentioned a deed to the Blackfriars Gatehouse. He is also mentioned in a lawsuit with regards to shares in the lease of the second Blackfriars Playhouse, and he owned perhaps one or two more properties. We'll first look at the Blackfriars Gatehouse. Here is how it is described in the deed. Abutting on a street leading down to Puddle Wharf on the east part right against the King's Majesty's Wardrobe, part of which said tenement is erected over a great gate leading to a capital messuage which sometime was in the tenure of William Blackwell, Esquire, deceased, and since that in the tenure or occupation of the Right Honourable Henry, now Earl of Northumberland. And also that plot of ground on the west side of this same tenement, which was lately enclosed with boards on two sides thereof by Anne Bacon, widow, so far and in such sort as the same was enclosed by the said Anne Bacon, and not otherwise, and being on the third side enclosed with an old brick wall, which said plot of ground was sometime parcel and taken out of a great piece of void ground lately used for a garden. And also the said brick wall and boards which do enclose the said part of ground, free entry, access, ingress, egress, and regress in, by and through the said great gate and yard thereunto the usual door of the said tenement. I'm going to try and locate this on a specific map. This is the Agus map, originally printed circa 1560. It's available on mapoflondon.uvic.ca/agas.htm. We are going to concentrate on this small section of the map. According to the University of Victoria, the buildings outlined in yellow represent the King's Majesty's Wardrobe. This in yellow is the road to Puddle Wharf. So if that's the road to Puddle Wharf, and we know where the King's Majesty's Wardrobe is the building in blue the gatehouse? And if so, is this building in green the Northumberland House? Could this building highlighted in yellow have been attached to the Northumberland House as either servants' quarters or an outbuilding? Could this item in gold be an old brick wall with some holes in it? Could this building with the mauve roof be Anne Bacon's tenement? Or could this building in red be Anne Bacon's tenement? What's in between all of these could be that said void plot of ground lately used for a garden. If you want, pause here and see if we have located the Blackfriars Gatehouse. Why did the Stratford man invest in the Blackfriars Gatehouse in 1613? This is the most likely reason he invested in the building. According to Gildersleeve in Government Regulation of the Elizabethan Drama, there was a charter of James I issued September 20, 1608, which read, "It is provided that the inhabitants of Blackfriars and Whitefriars shall be exempt from certain taxes and from holding certain offices. Later on in the video, it will be made clear why I make this conclusion. Next, we have shares in the lease of the second Blackfriars Playhouse. The paper trail begins when Edward VI granted land to Sir Thomas Cawarden in 1550 in the former Blackfriars Monastery. I do not have a graphic of Sir Thomas, so the figure on the left will have to suffice. In between is a map of the monastery, and of course Edward VI on the right. Cawarden died in 1559, but not before he sold his properties to Sir William More. He leased properties to Sir Henry Neville in 1560. Neville encouraged More to lease to Richard Farrant, who is a musician and manager of an acting company. Farrant died in 1580, but not before he illegally sublet some of the properties. His widow, Anne Farrant, leased property to Hunnes and Newman, two men involved in the theatre, in 1581. That's when the first Blackfriars Playhouse began operations. Hunnes and Newman in turn sold the lease to Henry Evans. He was a Welsh manager of the Children of St. Paul acting company, and he in turn sold the lease to Edward de Vere in 1583, and de Vere gave the lease to John Lilly, his secretary, in 1583. Events after May 1583. In June of that year, Sir William More sues Henry Evans, the same Henry Evans who sold the lease to de Vere. Anne Farrant sues Hunnes and Newman in the same year. Hunnes and Newman sue Anne Farrant in January 1584. More was granted repossession of his land in January 1584, in which point the first Blackfriars closes at Easter. Sir William More sold part of the property to James Burbage, the manager of the theatre Playhouse, in January 1596. Burbage builds the second Blackfriars Theatre then, but it closes in 1599. But not before. He sublet to Henry Evans, the same person who was sued by Moore in June 1583, and Nathan Giles and other members of a syndicate. From what I understand, from this point onwards, the second Blackfriars runs illegally, because remember, it closed in 1599. While the second Blackfriars was running mostly underground until 1642, Richard Burbage, William Sly, William Shakespeare, Henry Condell, John Hemmings, Cuthbert Burbage, and Thomas Evans purchased shares in the lease of the Blackfriars. But owning shares in the lease does not mean Shakespeare wrote plays. The logical fallacy here is inference from a name or description, and it is once again circumstantial in nature. Next, we have proof of tax evasion and bond defaults. 1596 and 1597, Shakespeare owed the London Borough 5 shillings in back taxes. 1598, we believe he was living in Billingsgate. In 1599, he was also owed taxes for Billingsgate, St. Helens Parish in London, and the Clink in Southwark. In 1600, he was owing 13 shillings 4 pence, which means or suggests that he defaulted on the taxes for 1598 and 1599, and these were taxes which were in arrears. In 1593 and 1597, he defaulted on some bonds, as well as 1598. Next, we have a surety of the peace issued against him by William Waite on November 29, 1596. It reads, William Waite begs sureties of peace against William Shakespeare, Francis Langley, Dorothy Soar, wife of John Soar, and Anna Lee, because of fear of death, etc., Writ of attachment issued and directed to the Sheriff of Surrey, returnable on the 18th of St. Martin term. This is an extended protection order. This means that William Waite feared for his life were he to have encountered any of these four defendants. This is another piece of circumstantial evidence, and nowhere does it mean that Shakespeare wrote a line. The logical fallacy here is again inference from a name or description. Next we have a 1612 deposition in the Bellet versus Montjoy. Stratfordians count these as separate instances of how the name was spelled, implying that there are more documented events in his life than there really are. Once again, inference from a name or description is the logical fallacy. It's circumstantial, and nowhere does it say he was a writer. Next we have a grant of arms. His father first applied for the grant in 1576, but it was rejected. The father's application was renewed in 1595 with the annotation non sans droit, which means no without right. He renews his father's application in 1601, and in 1602 the herald Peter Brooke accuses Sir William Dethick of elevating base persons. In 1602 he was referred to as generoso, able to bear arms, abbreviated GEN. Logical fallacy here is arguing from ignorance. Just because it doesn't say he was a writer doesn't mean necessarily that he was not a writer. You can only argue that so many times before it becomes tiresome. Also, we have an inference from a name or description. Next, we have the similar names on the title pages of books. Note that this is not personal evidence. It does not necessarily mean that the person on the title pages was the same person who owned property in Stratford. Next, we have literary references. Again, this is not personal evidence. In none of these references does it say, I saw William Shakespeare walking down the street with so-and-so talking about this play or that play. Nobody described who he was. Nobody gave anecdotes of his behavior or his personality. It's merely a name on a page. Finally, we have the literary paper trail. In 2001, Greenwood Press published Diana Price's book, Shakespeare's Unorthodox Biography, New Evidence of an Authorship Problem. In her book, she provides us with 10 categories by which we can determine whether or not an Elizabethan or Jacobean writer, or a writer from any era, for that matter, could be called a writer. The first is evidence of education. The plays and poems are chock full of information of an advanced sort, particularly of the law, falconry, court life, as well as places in Italy, France, which commoners would not necessarily have known. It's evidence of an advanced education of the sort which required being enrolled at either of the universities or any of the Inns of Court, which were the law schools. The second category is record of correspondence, especially with regard to literary matters. That means we have to have letters to the author and from the author. The third category is evidence of having been paid to write. Fourth, evidence of having a direct relationship with a patron. Fifth, extant original manuscript in the author's hand. Sixth, handwritten inscriptions, receipts, letters, etc., touching on literary matters. 7. Commendatory verses, epistles, or epigrams contributed or received in other people's books. 8. Miscellaneous records, particularly referred to personally as a writer. 9. Evidence of books owned, written in, borrowed, or given. And finally, notice at death as a writer. Here is the edited paper trail chart that I've constructed. It is contemporary direct and circumstantial evidence for 14 out of the 24 plays that Diana Price notes in her book. The data is taken from Appendix B from Dr. Ross Barber's PhD thesis, available at rossbarber.com. That's ROSBARBER.com. Let's check out Johnson to Peele. Here we see a checklist marking off all the categories that these 7 playwrights and writers fall into. Ben Jonson, Thomas Nash, Philip Massinger, Gabriel Harvey, Edmund Spenser, Samuel Daniel, and George Peele. Every writer is found in these 5 categories. We know they had an advanced education. We know they had a record of correspondence to and from each other and other people. There is evidence of a direct relationship with a patron for each and every one of these writers. There are commendatory verses, epistles, or epigrams contributed or received during their lifetime. And we also have miscellaneous records, particularly being referred to personally as a writer. Yet only 3 of these writers had their deaths noted, which suggests that the occupation or the profession of being a playwright or poet was not held in such high esteem. Let's check out Drayton to Kidd. Here we see Michael Drayton, George Chapman, William Drummond, Christopher Marlowe, Francis Beaumont, John Fletcher, and Thomas Kidd. Everyone seems to have been referred to as a writer. But notice that the smallest amount of categories that they fall into are for Marlowe, Beaumont, Fletcher, and Kidd, with 4 items. Let's check Drayton to Shakespeare. Shakespeare has absolutely no paper trail. This is a serious omission. Here is how he stacks up with respect to the other writers in terms of percentage and numbers. 11 out of the 14, or 78.57%, were educated. Thus begins the logical fallacy of arguing from ignorance. Just because we don't have a record of him being in school doesn't necessarily mean he was not in school. However, let's look at the rest of the categories. The same percentage, or 78.57%, wrote or received letters. 8, or 57.14%, were paid to write. Note that the payment notice for the King's Men does not tell us why Shakespeare was paid. Once again, the logical fallacy here is arguing from ignorance. 11 out of the 14, or 78.57% again, have documented connections to their patrons. We have extant manuscripts from 50% of these writers, or 7 out of the 14. There are receipts, etc., from 64.28% of these writers. And 12 out of the 14, or 85.71%, wrote or had these written for them, that is, commendatory verses, epistles, or epigrams, contributed or received from other writers. 100% were personally referred to as writers. We have evidence that 57.14% owned books. Only 42.85% had their deaths noticed. Again, this indicates that writing especially plays and poetry, was not held in such high regard. You can't make a positive out of a negative. The primary logical fallacy from the Stratfordians is arguing from ignorance, and a secondary one is special pleading. They will accept their man as a writer despite having no literary paper trail. I can understand that some of the items may be missing, but to have a minimum of 4 should be necessary to say that William Shakespeare of Stratford was a writer. Shakespeare could just as well not have existed given this evidence. Here is Professor Walter Hurst from his talk, What is Your Authority for That Statement? An Approach to Examining External Evidence of Early Modern Authorship again. He's quoting Robert Hume on knowledge. Scholars are accustomed to concentrate on what they have. Good historical practice requires us to be blunt in admitting what we lack. Stratfordians certainly admit what they lack, but they use special pleading constantly to excuse the fact that there is no literary paper trail for the man named William Shakespeare anywhere in the records. What do Stratfordians have left while he was still alive? First, a similar name on some title pages. Shakespeare lived in London for a while and avoided paying taxes there. Shakespeare may have owned shares in the lease of the Blackfriars 2 playhouse. He co-purchased a building in Blackfriars, probably to avoid taxes. One dubious payment notice. In something that I didn't add in these videos, the actor Augustine Phillips left him some money in his will. And finally, no literary paper trail. These 2 items are not compatible with him being a writer. A similar name on some title pages with no literary paper trail. If you want to claim the first item as evidence that he was the man whose name was on the title pages, you must add at least 2 items from the list that Diana Prices created for a literary paper trail. And I am being generous for this. Others would say you need a minimum of 4 because 4 was the minimum amount for Christopher Marlowe, Beaumont, Fletcher, and Thomas Kidd. No literary paper trail is the strongest case against the Stratford man being a writer. As Michael Dudley masterfully points out in his book, The Shakespeare Authorship Question and Philosophy,
virtually no currently recognized theory of belief, knowledge, justification, or truth can accommodate and support the Stratfordian model of Shakespearean authorship, nor the practices heretofore associated with it. The scholarly and literary advocates of this model have deliberately, albeit without full awareness, fatally situated both it and themselves as utter outliers to the scholarly enterprise, as otherwise and conventionally understood, in terms of engaging in the pursuit of truth through open inquiry.
and he continues,
Stratfordians proudly maintain their ethos, or authority, in the matter of the author's biography, without any hint of intellectual humility, and, as such, cannot be considered to be reality-based.
What do they have left from London and Stratford? This is an example of anacephalaiosis, which is a fancy word of saying I'm giving you a summary. In London, we had a similar name on some title pages. Shakespeare lived in London for a while and avoided paying taxes there. He may have owned shares in the lease of the Globe Playhouse as early as 1599. He co-purchased a building in Blackfriars, probably to avoid taxes. One dubious payment notice. The actor Augustine Phillips left him some money, and no literary paper trail. From Stratford, which is incontrovertible evidence of a man living there by the name of William Shakespeare. We have property deals, money lending suits, proof of grain forestalling, the Quiney letter which was not sent, family documents, a problematic will, other Stratford documents, and he was mentioned in some diaries in which none of them say he was a writer, where they could have easily said, "Oh, I know this guy named Shakespeare. He's a famous playwright. He's a famous poet." But they didn't. So what do they have left? Circumstantial evidence. The bottom line. Stratfordians rely on circumstantial evidence. They make inferences from the name. They argue from ignorance, as in the case of the literary paper trail. Oh, just because we don't have the documents doesn't mean they didn't exist at some point, but you can't make that excuse more than a couple times before it wears thin. And they dismiss, deny, or ignore counter evidence. The question still is, what evidence do Stratfordians really have? And the main question in this case about the evidence is this: is the evidence relevant, probative, distinct, strong, sharp, and well defined enough to lead us to conclude the Stratford businessman had a writing career? Thanks for watching. Stay safe.